Well, hello, everyone. This is Mike Hoffman. I'm the president of Arizona Benefit Plans. I wanted to welcome you to the Arizona Benefit Plans training series for agents, brokers, and consultants. I'm pretty excited about the offering that we're going to provide today, which we titled PBM and Contracting 101. So the basics of understanding some of the mechanics of a PBM and how it works, where the money goes, and contracting, how the entire system works in about 45 minutes or so. And this will become we hope, a continuing effort to kind of keep you educated. With COVID, of course, we can't get together at our offices and in our conference center. So this is our best chance to do that. So with that in mind, I want to introduce Truveris. Truveris is a specialty vendor that we have access to that does some very, very unique things in the pharmacy space. And actually, you will see a link to a bit of a sales presentation also in this package that we're sending you that will go in depth into what Truveris does. But the beautiful thing about our relationship with Truveris is that it comes with some really expert team members in the PBM and pharmacy contracting space, including Alicia Fluno. Alicia is the Chief Pharmacy Officer at Truveris, a pharmacist by trade, and a University of Wisconsin-Madison graduate. So hopefully there's no Big Ten animosity out there. But I just want to kind of jump into it. You should be able to see the slides and turn it over to Alicia to teach us about PBM and contracting. Alicia?
Thanks so very much, Mike, for that very kind introduction. Very excited to be here working with Arizona Benefit Plans around the pharmacy benefit. As you mentioned, I am a pharmacist by training. I started out my career with a little over a decade worth of practice in both retail and then in hospital pharmacy management settings. And then for the last 13 years or so, I've really been focusing on the managed care side of pharmacy, supporting a lot of plan sponsors on their pharmacy benefit. And Truveris is very excited to be here partnering with Arizona Benefit Plans on this conversation. Hopefully by the time that everything is all said and done today, I'm going to help to demystify some of those thoughts or ideas that you may have around the pharmacy benefit. So we want to start off with just a quick review of our agenda. We'll be talking about what is a PBM and understanding the role that they play in today's market. We'll move into a discussion around how PBMs contract with plan sponsors, and we'll touch on some of those concepts on how PBMs do make money. I'll provide a market primer with some of industry concepts and the impact that they have in today's marketplace. We'll review some ways in which plan sponsors can maximize the value from their pharmacy contract. And then we'll finish by reviewing just a few case studies at the end where we kind of give an example of how holding that PBM accountable has uncovered some significant savings for various different plan sponsors. So really the best way to understand this industry is to reflect on how everything started. So I'm going to take you down a little bit of a history lesson here, so bear with me for a second. But the PBM industry really is said to have started around 1968 with the first pharmacy benefit manager, or what we call conveniently now a PBM, which was Pharmaceutical Card Systems. They invented this plastic benefit card to purchase different medications at select pharmacies. By the time we got into the 70s, PBMs were starting to process paper claims for prescription drugs. And by the 80s, we really moved into more of an electronic claim adjudication process. And that's really when everything started to change. By the late 80s, healthcare and prescription drug costs were starting to escalate. the PBMs started steering prescribers to less expensive medications, lower cost generics, instead of utilizing brand medications. But it didn't take long for those PBMs to quietly move into marketing of more expensive brand drugs. And that's really where we started to see the connections between the pharmacy benefit industry and the pharmaceutical manufacturers start off. So over the last 30 years now, we've seen several different business models that the PBMs have brought to market. The first you may remember back in 1993, one of the larger PBMs at that point in time was Medco. And they established a relationship with the pharmaceutical company Merck and became Merck Medco. That relationship lasted about a decade, but it tragically ended with a couple of major lawsuits. And I think the industry realized that that PBM pharma combination was not really a good idea. In 2007, at that time, CVS, which was a retail pharmacy, acquired the PBM Caremark. And not only did this start the relationships that we see today between the retail pharmacies and the PBMs, but it's where we saw the function of a PBM start to change. So PBMs went from simply processing prescription transactions to now managing a pharmacy benefit. They took a lot of the functions that we see today on the left-hand side of the screen of what a PBM does and started to bring those to market. So negotiating drug discounts, providing drug utilization review and different disease management. And this is where they really started to create formularies for preferred drug products as well. Now, the latest strategy that really has started since about 2015 is when we saw United Health Group commit to providing full PBM services. They had worked with different PBMs in the past, but they've finally decided to develop and purchase and merge together multiple PBMs in the development of what we now know as OptumRx. This latest trend towards providing full PBM services where they're vertically integrated with a health plan has now been mirrored by 3 of the main PBMs in the industry. Now, the jury is still out on how well these organizations will streamline healthcare, but these PBMs account for about 75 to 80% of the PBM market. And we know that they're going to try to leverage all of those lives with their new organizations and the assets that they have under management. So this all really goes to confirm that the pharmacy benefit ecosystem is complex and it is constantly evolving. And while we could spend the next 2 hours probably talking about the chart that's on the right hand of this slide, the role of the PBM really is quite simple. Every time you or a member of your health plan fills a prescription at a pharmacy, the PBM's involved. They're the ones who process the claims and communicate to the pharmacy what to charge and if there are any safety issues based on the other medications that you take. Over the last couple of years, the media, the government, and even some payers have had a really strong focus on the rising cost of prescription drugs. And there is a lot of finger pointing between both the pharmaceutical manufacturers and the PBMs as to who's responsible for the high cost of drugs. And while PBMs are really responsible for a service, they're not the ones that are creating the list price of the drug. So with that, there are plenty of ways that PBMs do make revenue, and it's not necessarily evident to an unsophisticated buyer of those services. So really over the next couple of slides, I want to focus our attention on different PBM contracting techniques and the impact that those techniques have on the PBM's bottom line. So turning our focus now to what we call PBM pricing models. There's two main contract structures that a PBM will use when contracting with plan sponsors. On the left-hand side there, you see what's called the traditional pricing. This is also known in the industry as spread pricing. And the other in the middle that is commonly talked about is what's considered pass-through pricing. First, I want to focus on that traditional pricing model. In this kind of a contract, the PBM will basically guarantee a set discount for brand drugs, generics, specialty drugs. And the PBM really makes their profit, or what we call spread, on the cost between what the plan sponsor pays to the PBM and what the PBM pays to the pharmacy. So the lower that the PBM can negotiate the cost with that pharmacy, the more profit the PBM ends up making. In those traditional contracts, PBMs typically do not charge an administrative fee, and their main source of revenue is made off of that spread pricing of the drug. So contrast that to what's shown here in the middle, a pass-through contract. This type of a contract structure is where the PBM will charge the plan sponsor exactly what the PBM pays to the pharmacy. And since there's no revenue made off of these individual claims, the PBM will charge plan sponsors what they claim to be a full and fair admin fee for those services. So there's a couple of PBMs in the marketplace today that will contract with pass-through pricing for all dispensing channels: retail, mail order, and specialty. But for most PBMs, that pass-through pricing really only happens in the retail segment, which is why I've got a third box here on the slide, which is more of a hybrid approach. So for most PBMs, their idea of that pass-through contract is really just passing through the pricing at the retail pharmacy to the plan sponsor. And then they do charge an admin fee for that. However, when you think of mail order and specialty pharmacies, they'll apply the first box, that traditional pricing logic, to those claims, preserving the spread that they make from those dispensing channels. And the huge thing to note about this is that those PBMs most likely own those dispensing channels. So the specialty pharmacy and the mail order pharmacy is usually owned by that PBM, which becomes a significant revenue source to the PBM. Now, regardless of the contract structure that might be chosen by any plan sponsor, PBMs also have two ways in which they can contract or share rebates with plan sponsors. The first is listed here as a flat amount per claim, or a set dollar amount per claim. So similar to traditional pricing, the PBM will make profit or spread between that rebate guarantee that's paid to the plan sponsor and what they can negotiate with the pharmaceutical manufacturer. So the higher now that they can negotiate these rebates with pharma, the more profit that the PBM makes. On the contrast, the PBM can also choose to share a percent of the rebate value with the plan sponsor, which is really more of that pass-through type rebate model. So it's very common in contracts today for PBMs to pass through up to 100% of the value of the rebates to the plan sponsor. And the one thing I want to point out before we move on to the next slide is, regardless of what type of a contract model you have, whether it's a traditional model or some type of a hybrid, the rebates can be contracted in a way that's separate from that pricing model. So if you have a traditional pricing model in place today from a discount and administrative fee perspective, you can still have 100% pass through of that rebate value to the plan sponsor. So some of you may be thinking to yourself, what about transparent contracts? We've heard so much about transparency in the PBM industry. And unfortunately, the word transparent in our industry is probably one of the least transparent words used in the pharmacy benefits. About 10 to 15 years ago, when all of the PBM contracts were written, they were usually written in that traditional pricing manner. And then plan sponsors and different activists in the industry really demanded transparency to better understand how PBMs were making money. So the PBMs responded with that pass-through pricing model. But as we now know, unfortunately, that left the PBM to use creative ways to find different revenue sources. So when we use the word transparency in the PBM marketplace, what we're really trying to talk about is the full disclosure of PBM revenue. So what I really want to share on this slide here is the chart that's off to the right-hand side. And this is cited from Drug Channels. You'll see that just over half of the revenue that a PBM makes comes from the specialty and mail order channels that we just talked about a moment ago were pharmacy channels that most PBMs own. Another 30% of the revenue into a PBM really comes from what they keep on rebates and what they collect in administrative fees. And then there's about another 15%, that orange segment there, that comes from the spread that they make on traditional retail pricing. So that that cost difference on the retail networks. So all this really goes to show that PBMs are really good at finding unique revenue sources to support their businesses. And I really feel that it's our job to collaboratively work together to bring that value back to the plan sponsors and to their members. So as we shift a little bit here to our market primer, what I do want to talk about is kind of what we're seeing in the prescription drug pipeline. So about 5 years ago, the consulting community shared predictions all over that specialty spend would probably double by the year 2020. And even in recent PBM health reports, it's really showing that specialty spend has almost tripled in the last decade. So as a self-insured employer, you may be nodding your head with me thinking that, yeah, this is true. I agree with that. So many people ask us, what is driving that specialty trend? And the simple answer to the rising cost of specialty drugs is really around utilization. It's the utilization of new drugs, drugs getting new FDA approved indications, and new patients starting on these medications. So yes, there is some drug inflation that comes into factor here as well. But utilization really is becoming the biggest factor driving that specialty spend. Now, in the past decade, we have seen anywhere from 35 to 63 new specialty drugs approved on an annual basis. That compares to about 10 or 15 new specialty drugs for the 2 decades prior to that. So the good news for patients is that we've got a lot of great medications on the market to treat or now even cure some of these most chronic and debilitating disease states. We've also seen the number of FDA approved indications for these drugs once they're on the market expand. So Humira is a drug that most likely tops everybody's annual costs. So you may have heard of this medication before. It's really a good example of this. So Humira was originally brought to market in 2002 for the treatment of rheumatoid arthritis. And now fast forward to today, Humira is indicated to treat 10 different disease states. So as you can imagine, as we continue to add more disease states to treatment patterns, obviously costs will rise. The last thing to consider really around specialty utilization is the number of patients that these drugs can treat. Now, statistics from CDC on chronic diseases show that about 6 out of 10 or 60% of adults in the United States have obesity, diabetes, hypertension, or some type of cardiovascular disease. Taking that a step further, about 40% of adults have 2 or more of these chronic disease states. So plans today spend about 40 to 50% of their annual dollars on specialty drugs. And right now that's being used to treat about 2% of your population. Can you imagine what is going to happen to your plan costs when specialty drugs to treat chronic diseases like diabetes or cardiovascular disease make it into the market? To put that into perspective, our next slide really starts to reveal what the drug pipeline looks like over the next couple of years. So currently there's about 7,000 drugs that are under development at various stages in the United States. That number really is overwhelming when you think of the number of pharmaceutical manufacturers that are out there. But what's great to know is that about 75% of those drugs are potentially first-in-class treatments. So this means we'll be able to help so many people today that don't have treatment options for their disease states currently. Now, of those 7,000 drugs that are in development, about 600 of them, or 8%, are really expected to come to market in the next couple of years. And those odds don't sound as impressive, but it's one of the reasons that, drugs do cost a lot in the United States. Now, reflecting back to our last slide, the scary realization is that 64% of those 600 new drugs will be considered specialty therapies. Many of them are for different disease states like cancer and the various different types of cancer that are out there, or they might be for other rare disease states as well. But there are some of these specialty medications under review and under study for chronic diseases like diabetes. So if you're not talking about the specialty drug market with your broker, with your PBM today, chances are this is going to be a conversation that you will want to make sure happens at the next annual review. So turning our conversation to a broader look at healthcare in general, according to a survey by the National Business Group on Health, we're expected to see the cost of health benefits increase by at least 5% this year. And add that to the fact now that we're going through a pandemic, that 5% may actually end up being a little bit of a conservative estimate. Touching on the trend that we mentioned earlier with PBMs and health plans around vertical integration, the next bullet there is from a health payer intelligence survey that shared that up to 30% of employers are going to be consolidating their benefits into an integrated provider over the next couple of years. From that same survey, we also know that employers are looking to technology-driven solutions, such as telemedicine and different analytical services to help manage their benefit into the future. And in this last bullet, it actually comes from a Bloomberg article that admittedly, it did come out before the pandemic, but I think it really reflects the market still today. Many plan sponsors and employers are very concerned about the costs associated with future gene therapy approvals. You thought specialty drugs were scary. These definitely take it to a whole new level. So to date, there's only one gene cell therapy that has been approved in the United States today. If you're not familiar with it, and hopefully your exposure is really limited to what I'm about to share now. But our first gene cell therapy drug is called Luxturna. It is in the market. It's an $850,000 treatment for patients with inherited retinal disease. So obviously a very small number of patients to treat, but still a very important therapy for those members. Now, brace yourself, because as this fourth bullet here states, we're anticipating another dozen or so of these therapies to be approved by the year 2025. So those will have a significant impact to everybody's bottom line. Even with everything that's going on in the US today, the FDA is still continuing to prioritize review for breakthrough therapies of rare diseases, including cancer, including some of these gene cell therapies, in prioritizing those in the review process. However, the FDA has recently said that their rate of approval of new drugs may slow down a bit in the near future, really because of the burden of COVID and how that's going to shift priorities for the FDA. So the big picture now is that in the wake of everything that could be significant costs for new and novel therapies and new vaccines coming out to market, many plan sponsors are looking for solutions and ideas really to manage these costs better. So I do anticipate that the next question you'll be asking is, how can we keep the pharmacy benefit affordable for our company and for our members? And to the left-hand side of this slide, even though it's listed as member noise, these are the ways that historically we've been able to manage the pharmacy benefit. The traditional approach has either been shifting costs from the plan to members, by adjusting premiums, potentially increasing copays or coinsurances, or some people have even, gone to high deductible health plans as an offering. We've also tried to control cost by limiting access to drugs. So whether that's through formularies, through clinical programs like prior authorization or step therapies, or whether it's through a narrower retail pharmacy network. All of these levers are absolutely still great ways to drive savings to the plan, but they do come at a cost to the member, which is that disruption and the member noise. We've heard from way too many clients this year alone that the disruption that they and their employees and families have had to go through with COVID has been a lot. And that solutions that we bring to the table really need to have meaningful financial impact with minimal to no member noise. So now more than ever, we're really looking for ways to work with clients to maximize the contract with their current PBM. So we put the plan in control and drive value to the organization through contracting measures that may have little to no disruption to the members. So in our last section of slides, we're going to kind of go through some of these ways to maximize your contract. So when it comes to terminology in a PBM contract, I cannot say enough that the definitions matter. As a basic definition, as basic as it may seem, PBMs really use specific language, or sometimes they even use the lack of clarity around language to manipulate the definitions in their favor. So take, for instance, the idea of the first two items here, brands and generic drugs. That concept seems pretty simple. A drug is either one or the other. And well, unfortunately, the PBM industry hasn't really made it that crystal clear. So brand drugs are really thought of as the first product that's developed, patented, and brought to market by the originator pharmaceutical manufacturer. And generic drugs really are that same active ingredient, so identical active ingredient, and therapeutically equivalent to the brand drug, but just made by a different manufacturer or sometimes by the same manufacturer at a lower cost. The complexity around these definitions really comes into play when we see the PBMs using generic drug claims to help achieve brand drug discounts. We also see the PBMs removing certain brand drug claims to meet their contractual guarantees. So the way that the PBM crafts their definitions around brand and generic drugs really needs to be carefully evaluated in order to minimize some of these PBM games. Taking it to the next level, the third item there, the term single source generic, that's a term that's used to describe the first generic alternative of a branded medication. So this single source status is usually granted exclusively to one manufacturer for about 6 months after the brand drug patent expires. And since there's only one generic manufacturer competing with that brand for market share, we typically don't see a large drop in the plan costs when there's only a single source generic out on the market. However, after that exclusive period ends, other generic manufacturers may be able to enter the market, and that's usually when we see the laws of supply and demand take over and plan costs start to get driven down. Now, going back to the concept of why definitions matter, PBMs can take these single source generic drugs and exclude them from the brand guarantees, include them to the brand guarantees simply to make sure that they're getting to the brand discount guarantees that they've provided forward. Some PBMs, I should say, will actually do this when there's multiple generic manufacturers too. So it may not just be single as in one, it could be 2 or 3 generic manufacturers where they'll take these single source generics and apply them to the brand drug discounts. So really, again, crafting those strong definitions will help stop those PBMs from manipulating the recategorization of these drugs. The fourth definition that I really want to go through quickly is around specialty drugs. So these are medications, as we shared earlier, that are used by about 2% of the population. And they either support or treat some of those very rare, complex disease states. They often come at a very high price tag, and they comprise about 50% or about half of the drug cost under the pharmacy benefit today. In case you're not aware, these drugs are also used under the medical benefit. And what we see when we look at those two benefits is that the cost under pharmacy is usually just about the same cost as what we see under the medical benefit as well. So specialty drugs can be broken down into both brands and generics. And as we touched on earlier, this class of drugs is making up a majority of what's in the drug pipeline today. So how the PBMs define specialty can make a significant impact to the financial position of a PBM contract, if not now, for sure into the future. Now, the last definition that I want to bring up is this newer category called biosimilars. So a biosimilar drug basically meets the same standards of safety and efficacy as an originator biologic product that's in the specialty market today. However, these biosimilars are not identical to the originator product. They follow a different approval process, and they're definitely not automatically interchangeable with the originator product. So one thing to point out about the US biosimilar market is that it really is much less mature than what we see in other countries like Europe. And for this reason, many PBMs don't include a definition of biosimilar drugs in contracts today. And for now, that may be fine, as a lot of the biosimilars in the US market are really utilized under the medical benefit. However, as you enter into a new 3-year contract with a PBM, having strong biosimilar definitions is really going to become of increasing importance. Now, I do want to point out before I move on to the next slide that these 5 drug definitions only scratch the surface at the important definitions that we need to include in a PBM contract. Definitions around rebates and pricing logic and other industry terms really need to be scrutinized in order to make sure that we're signing off on a good, solid PBM contract. So beyond definitions, there's so many other things to consider in a pharmacy contract. So take rebates, for example. Not only is it important to push PBMs for 100% pass-through of that rebate value earned, which we spoke about earlier, but today we really need to understand what revenue the PBM is classifying as a rebate. So the most thorough definition of a rebate consists of base and market share rebates. It'll consist of revenue that's attributable to drug inflation, any revenue that's received by the PBM, a PBM affiliate, or the PBM's GPO based on prescription drugs. And then most definitions will have this generic catchphrase of all other pharmaceutical revenue. Some people will also throw in manufacturer admin fees, or what we sometimes call MAF, into the definition of a rebate. So really, these are all sources of revenue that a PBM can receive from the pharma manufacturers based on the utilization of your members' prescriptions. So when your rebate definition excludes any one of these categories, that then becomes a new revenue source to the PBM, which we spoke about earlier. Now, I know we talked extensively around specialty drugs and the pipeline earlier in this webinar, but I really would be remiss if I didn't talk about how you can strategize with your PBM around these costly medications. The best thing that we can do today is really to monitor that specialty pipeline and understand how these drugs that are coming to market will be utilized under your population. So we all know that these drugs are changing the lives of the members who require them, and we absolutely want to be able to support those members. But it has to be at a level of investment that your organization can afford. So being able to anticipate both the short-term and the long-term impact of these medications, ensuring appropriate utilization of the drugs when they do come to market, really is essential to managing these drugs. From there, we can also look to different resources from pharma. So whether it be coupons that are in the market, patients assistance programs, or even different member engagement programs for these medications, all of this needs to be taken into account when you're managing that specialty category. And finally, with biosimilars, again, this group of drug gets overlooked so easily in today's market because of where our US market is today. So most PBM contracts don't have a definition of biosimilars. They're usually mute, which isn't a great thing. So it's really hard to predict exactly what needs are going to be in a PBM contract around biosimilars. Yes, we know that there's going to need to be a definition around these drugs, but what we don't know is what's needed beyond that. Will these drugs be given different separate guarantees like we see with specialty drugs? Will they become part of the specialty drug list? Or even will rebates be available for these drugs? The biggest takeaway around biosimilars is that this market is immature, and what we need to do now is prepare for future flexibility in the PBM contracts around these medications. And lastly, when we are talking about strategies to manage the contract, we would definitely encourage you to demand greater transparency around your PBM and the relationship with your PBM and the contract. So listed here are a few more ideas where you can start. So auto refill programs. These are programs that are administered both by PBMs and actually by retail pharmacies as well. And in both situations, the pharmacies will refill medications at the earliest point possible when these auto refill programs are turned on. So in a mail order setting, basically they'll charge the credit card that the member has on file and ship the medication. And in a retail setting, they'll refill the medication and place it in the will call bin and encourage the member to come in and pick up their medication the next time that they're in the store. The net result of both of these scenarios is that members and the plan are paying for these medications early. And if this habit or this routine goes on for about a year's worth of time, the result is going to be that your member has about 15 months of medication on hand for a 12-month period of time. So clearly, this leads to a lot of waste in the system. Now, I'm not saying that these programs need to be turned off, because they do have some benefit around member engagement and keeping your members on their medications. But we really should be working with your PBM to manage these programs a little bit more efficiently. Another program to touch on is prior authorizations. So many higher priced medications, when you think of your specialty drugs and probably the biosimilars into the future, they need approval or prior authorization in order to verify that the medication is appropriate for the member. And when a member has their claim stopped because of one of these PA edits, if that member walks away, doesn't get their medication filled, or maybe chooses a different medication, there's no fee to the plan. However, if the PBM needs to evaluate any paperwork from the prescriber, contact the prescriber in any way to verify that the medication is necessary, then the PBM charges what's known as a prior authorization fee. So like I said, most specialty medications go through a prior authorization. And as we shared earlier, if the population using these medications grow, or if the number of medications under prior authorizations grow, at a certain point, plan sponsors are going to be stuck with some pretty hefty fees around prior authorization. So although many contract evaluations today don't focus much on the prior authorization fees, this is another area of growing financial impact into the future that we should be evaluating closely. And then finally, the last thing that I want to talk about before we get into our case studies is addressing what we call guarantee offsetting. This is a very sneaky habit that many PBMs will try to insert into PBM contracts. So what happens is, when evaluating pricing guarantees, if the PBMs are allowed to offset guarantees, where basically shortfall in one guarantee can be neutralized by overperformance in another guarantee, then the overall value that that contract brings to the plan sponsor and their members is significantly minimized from a financial perspective. So continuing on along that theme of transparency, this is really our last slide to illustrate how some case studies have evolved to show how important it is to hold those PBMs accountable and how critical it is to monitor for the games that PBMs play. So the first case study that's kind of listed here, a marketing firm with about 3,000 lives that we help to manage. What we found for them at the end of a contract reconciliation period around their guarantees is that the PBM was doing the last thing I just mentioned. They were offsetting the guarantees. When we worked with the PBM to correct that based on the way that the contract was written, we ended up saving that marketing firm about $1 million in savings by not allowing the PBM to offset guarantees. The second case study that's listed here is a little larger in size. It's an investment bank where we were reconciling their ingredient cost guarantees for them, and noticed that the PBM was using those single source generics to apply to the brand drug discount and elevated, if you will, the discount that we were seeing on brand cost drugs. This was a shorter period of time. We were only doing this, and we saw that after the first quarter of what the investment bank was going through. And that observation ended up saving the bank about $38,000 for that quarter by recategorizing those single source generics as generics. And then the third case study that is here is magnified a little bit because of the size of this client. But we did see a PBM reclassifying specialty drugs in order to get out of, if you will, paying on specialty drug rebates. So they moved classes of drugs from specialty over to the non-specialty group, which was not allowed under the contract for this state. So when we identified that for this plan, we ended up saving them about $46 million by reclassifying those drugs as specialty medications and getting the specialty rebates for them. So with that, hopefully you've been able to kind of stay with me here and help from the conversation perspective to demystify some of the things that are happening within the PBM industry. I really want to thank you for the opportunity to highlight the importance of all of this transparency and accountability in the marketplace, because it is an inherently complex industry that we're working with here. So through our partnership with Arizona Benefit Plans, we really look forward to optimizing your PBM contracts and driving value to your organizations and to your members as well. And as Mike had alluded to earlier, we look forward to continuing these education series. So thank you.
Alicia, thanks very much for spending a little bit of time with us. That'll end our web training today. I look forward to sharing with you guys the sales pitch for Truveris. It'll be another link. Take about 15 minutes to kind of go through and talk about the Truveris value proposition. We hope you gain some things from PBM 101. And again, thanks to the Truveris team.